Well, good afternoon and welcome to our fourth Wednesday webinar. And thank you for joining us, whether you're watching this live or as a recording later on. My name is Tim Ferguson and I'm part of the ministries team at the Baptist Union. And next few weeks, we've got a bit of a programme now of Wednesday webinars. So each Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we should have a webinar hosted off the BU website. You can go to the site and see what titles are coming up. We will post a list of those when we've got some of the final details sorted out. Next Wednesday, I can tell you, however, that we'll be exploring a new anthology of worship resources. And it's called Gathering Up the Crumbs, and this has been written as a celebration of the centenary of the ordination and accreditation of women in Baptist ministry. And Pat Took will be in conversation with some of the authors and the editors of that book. And do join us if you can, and you can find out more about the book and also how, of course, to get hold of it. Just to say, the following week, 13th of May, actually there won't be a webinar hosted by us because it clashes with a webinar that Fresh Streams are organising. And I think Kate Coleman and Ken Benjamin will be sharing some thoughts on leadership on that webinar. And we'll have some details on our website to point you in the right direction to attend that if you want to. Well, today our title is Contemplative Practices in Lockdown. And we're going to think a little bit about how contemplation might be a useful devotional practice in this current season. So I'm really pleased to be joined, as you can see, by Jane Day and by Margaret Gibbs. Jane is the Centenary Enabler at the Baptist Union, and Jane has a brief to encourage further our integration of women in Baptist ministry. She's also a spiritual director and professional coach. Margaret is minister of Perry Rise Baptist Church, a multicultural church in South London. Margaret brings experiences of other cultures, not only through that church experience, but also through a time served with BMS World Mission overseas. So Margaret and Jane, can I say thank you for joining us and welcome to you both. I'm going to hand over to Jane in a moment. Can I just point people towards a handout? So there's a handout that people may find helpful to open a bit later on. If you're on the YouTube website, you should see a link beneath the video. And that's true also if you're on the Baptist Union website. If you're full screen at the moment, you may just have to come out of full screen. And if you click on the link, it should open another window on your browser with the handout, and you'll be able to toggle between the handout and the broadcast as necessary as we go. So to start off our conversation, Jane, I'm going to hand over to you to ask us a question just to get the conversation started.
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be with you. And I thought it would be helpful as a beginning today just to reflect on a couple of questions that both, or all three of us, in fact, Tim, Margaret and myself, have been reflecting on. You'll see the question on the screen. What spiritual practices have been helpful during lockdown, and what has been a struggle during this time? I'm going to kick off because I've had more time to perhaps think about this than others, then I'll open up space. For me, during lockdown, one of the things that I found really helpful is having a kind of set pattern, a set liturgy and rhythm at the beginning of the day. And, this is something that I've done in the past and has been an ongoing discipline. But I think I became very aware of this early on. And reflected quite a bit alongside my Enneagram type. Some of you may be familiar with Enneagram. And when things are out of place or I'm in a difficult space, one of the things that helps me tremendously is a routine. So I've just been doing a simple practice of reading the same pattern liturgically each day. And I've been able to do that with Steve, my husband, and that's been a real gift. So that's been helpful. It's also been helpful to keep a gratitude journal, very aware of so much to be grateful for. So that's been a help. I think the thing I've struggled with is initially the lack of kind of physical activity, although I feel very privileged that we can exercise each day for the suggested hour. My pattern has been often to kind of swim 3 or 4 times a week. And I think there's something that's connected with our physical bodies and spirituality. So I had to work quite hard at the beginning, although there is a new pattern now. But what does spirituality feel and look like in terms of our physical bodies? So whilst it was hard, I think there's a new pattern. So it's been a mixed bag. I'd love to hear from you, Margaret. What has it been like for you?
Hello, everybody. And I have to confess to being on the introvert side. And so I've found the silence of the lockdown really wonderful. And it's a rare opportunity to have silence for long enough that you can really allow the inner voices to start to shut up, especially if you're a minister, I think, your own voice and others. And I feel really grateful for that opportunity. I'm sure a lot of you will agree that there's been the opportunity to notice the nature and the fabulous spring we've had this year. I understand that city birds have to learn to sing extra loud so they can hear each other over the traffic. And I can tell that the birds here in London are still singing very loudly, even though there is no traffic. And that is absolutely fantastic. I've enjoyed that. Challenging for me, though, is missing out on corporate worship, although I'm very grateful for all the ways we have to connect as Christians through technology. It's a real blessing to have fellowship that way. But there's something about being present and the atmosphere of corporate worship and the spontaneity of it. I actually hear God speaking to me personally and to the church in those moments, and I've really missed that. I look forward to being able to meet again before too long.
Thanks, Margaret. And Tim?
Yeah, I think for me, what's been fantastic has been the space. I'm a morning person, so I get up and I tend to do anything devotionally, particularly in the morning. There's just a space to journal. So reading the Bible, reading other books, to have the time to follow some trains of thoughts over a number of days. You don't have to rush it or move on, but to come back and to capture some of those thoughts in writing, I found to be really helpful and much richer for me than is usually possible. I think the difficult thing for me is just the monotony. So where every day is the same, and to be honest, the news is still the same. And in many ways, the prayer needs, although overwhelming, are pretty much the same. So I've actually found prayers of intercession, my own praying for things or for people, to be quite difficult just because of that sameness of the season.
Thanks, Tim and Margaret. I hope that's a helpful introduction to your friends, and you might too want to ask the same question. So what spiritual practices have been helpful to you during lockdown and a struggle, and how are you sharing those with others at this moment? So I'm going to move into a time where I just share 3 invitations, really. I'm going to share one invitation of a suggested spiritual practice during lockdown. Then I'm going to hand over to Margaret and then back to Tim, or back to myself rather. So we'll have 3 invitations today. As I was thinking about this webinar, I was really praying for 2 things. And the first is that we may be present to you today. So Margaret, Tim and myself, that we are present with you in the space that you find yourself in right now. It may be, as we have this conversation, that you want to imagine your favourite chair or a favourite place, and we are sat together having a conversation that is a holding space. There are questions and comments, as you know, that you're invited to participate in. So we want to pick up on those throughout and sharing a conversation. So that was the kind of first prayer, that we would be present together. The second prayer is that this would not feel like you have more things to do. The last thing we would want people to kind of go away with is thinking, oh, I've got another thing to do right now, when life is already a bit stressful and a bit different. So what we offer are simply that, just invitations. And with any invitation, you can accept, reject, or come back to it later. So we hope these are a gift to you, and you can make use of them as you wish to. But before I come to those invitations, I think it's worth pausing and just saying why a kind of webinar on contemplation during lockdown. Well, we are mindful right now that there has been frenetic activity, and the church has played its part in such activity. If your inbox has been anything like mine, I've received invitations about how to care for my mental health alongside what the mission priorities might be for me in this season. I've received invites about how to connect digitally, how to do worship and Zoom meetings online, and everything else. I've even learnt how to spring clean my home, should I want to take up that invitation. And none of these are wrong, of course, but what I'm hearing less of is the voice that invites a contemplative response. I'm hearing less invitations of Holy Saturday to that particular voice when, after the pain and grief of Good Friday, the women who had prepared the spices and ointments for Jesus's body rested. It's a little verse tucked away in Luke's Gospel, which reads, "On the Sabbath day they rested according to the commandment." To rest, to pause, to stop, to contemplate, however we understand this, is really hard. So the first thing I want to say is, let's not pretend that contemplation and pausing and stopping is easy, because it isn't, and it takes immense courage to do that. I've heard many people in the past few weeks say to me or others, if I stop, I cry too much. I can't sit still, I'm restless. I don't want to stop because I don't want to face my fears. And as I've listened to those voices and taken them to prayer on the Emmaus Road, I've been really mindful that behind those voices there is pain, confusion, sadness, tears, and fears. In Terry Waite's book on solitude, who, as we know, spent 5 years in solitary confinement, he hints at this fear when he says, I had to learn how to control my imagination in order to prevent myself becoming paralysed with fear. I discern that solitude needs to be approached gradually and calmly. It's not just a matter of being quiet for an hour or so. So I just wonder if this is a season that invites us to tread carefully and walk gently in terms of a more contemplative spirit. So our first invitation is to invite you to ponder your image of God. Everything I'm sharing right now, there will be a handout. It's already there on YouTube and the BU website. So don't worry if you miss anything. But this is a space to think about our image of God, and it's something that I often use when I meet new spiritual directees for the first time, and some have never really thought about their image of God. And the reason why I think it's important is because our image of God determines the relationship that we have with God and with others. And this can be a help or a hindrance. For example, if we imagine a judgmental God, then that will affect our relationships and how we relate to God. If we see God as a friend, that too will impact our relationships and those around us. And then there may be images which we have outgrown. For example, if we image God as Father Christmas, might not be anything wrong with that, and some of you may still hold on to that image, but perhaps we've outgrown that too. And there's much to unpack here, and if we were offering spiritual direction, which we're not, but if we were, we might pause longer and say which images of God are helpful to us or hindering us during lockdown. It's been suggested by a couple of authors that we become the God we adore. We meet God as the God we image. We become the God we adore. And I guess during this season, who is the God we image? Who is the God that is influencing your life today? Does your image of God help or hinder spiritual growth? And is your current experience of lockdown, I wonder, is that giving birth to a new image of God? These are big questions, I realise that, and that's why we intentionally put them on a handout. as we reflect together, and you can take away and ponder after. So our first invitation is to think about our images of God and contemplate them during lockdown. I'm going to hand over to Margaret, and she will share a second invitation with us. Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you very much, Jane. And it seems to me at a time like this, which we have not planned ourselves, but which has been given to us, we do have a choice as to how we are going to reflect. And if we have an understanding of our own personality and preferences and our own particular spirituality, it's easy to opt for the obvious, which is to go with the practices that we're used to and which we know really suit us. And that may be the right thing to do. That may be really profitable to be able to spend some extra time in that way. But there is an option to choose to try out some other practices which may not at first sight seem obvious for us. And that gives us an opportunity to round out our spiritual understanding and techniques and perhaps grow in our spirituality. And so I want to offer an invitation to try out some Christian meditative practices which come to us via another culture. And bearing in mind that Christianity came from the East, an Eastern culture to us, perhaps now is the time to try to reclaim some more Eastern meditative practices that really are Christian and which are spoken about in scriptures, but to have some techniques to know how to do that. And I want to recommend a book to you, which is Sadhana, A Way to God, Christian Exercises in Eastern Form, written by Father Anthony de Mello. And the details of this book can be found on the handout. Father de Mello is a retreat master of many years' experience operating in India, but also around the world. And in this book, you will find 47 meditative exercises. They're very down to earth. They have clear instructions. They start for real beginners, and they work their way up to being quite advanced techniques for meditation. And they are really, really helpful if you want to try them out. I must emphasize that each exercise needs to be practiced for quite a while before you begin perhaps to benefit from it, particularly if this isn't your particular usual style of spirituality. Some of the earlier techniques are brilliant as pre-meditation practices, helping us in the first instance to learn a bit of stillness, to learn more awareness. And something that's useful for me is to learn to recognize distraction. When we're trying to be still, a distracting thought comes along, pops into our head, and we lose the stillness that we're trying to achieve. And so giving some practical techniques to learn how to recognize and deflect distractions and remain in the moment. Really brilliant exercises, growing in perhaps depth as you go along. There are exercises on breathing, bodily awareness, on listening, and moving on into some more complex ones, exercises that work towards healing of the memory, Ignatian style reflection, meditating on the name of God, or on the heart of Christ. I've included some of the easier meditations in the handout so you can try them out for yourselves. I've also put a link to Anthony de Mello's spirituality website if you want to check out a few more up-to-date things that he's involved in. Finally, I have included a walking meditation because walking is one of the things we're allowed to do at the moment, whether outside, but you can do this meditation indoors because basically it deconstructs walking into a very, very, very slow practice where we experience each step, lifting one foot, lifting lifting, moving it forwards, moving, and placing it down, placing. Anthony de Mello mentions you might not like to do this in public, as it will look very strange, but it is an opportunity to re-experience a natural activity and learn to be attentive and resist distraction. And commend this book to you and hope you find it helpful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Margaret. I was in the meditative state there myself, so thank you for that gift. A beautiful invitation. So as Margaret's offered our second invitation to reflection from another culture, I want to offer a third and final invitation. It was Mary Oliver, the late poet, who said, "I don't exactly know what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention. I don't know what a prayer is exactly. I do know how to pay attention." Our third invite is a practice of a prayer of examine. The word examine comes from a Latin word that means both an examination and the act of weighing or judging something. I think we have to be careful with that word judging, particularly right now. But the prayer of examine ultimately helps a person to reflect upon their inner life. It was Socrates who said the unexamined life is not worth living. So this particular prayer comes from an Ignatian tradition of spirituality. And in a few sentences, it's really about pausing and offering you the invitation to pray and reflect at the end of each day. Usually takes about 15 to 20 minutes. For me, this prayer has been personally helpful in my own life. I've seen the gifts that it's also been to others. Because I don't believe there is anything in our lives that does not kind of request or deserve God's attention. And in fact, the very humdrum and maybe what seems a bit boring sometimes in our lives, it's those very things which God is concerned with. And I've wondered during this season of lockdown, is this an opportunity for us to pray a bit more and pause a bit more intentionally so we don't lose the gifts of this season and reflect with the help of a prayer of examine. There are a number of prayers that have actually been floating around various social media in recent weeks in response to coronavirus, and some people have drafted different prayers that they might want to use during this season. Again, it's on the website, but I'm just going to read a few questions which also form part of that handout. So the invite is to pause at the end of the day and ask questions such as, what am I grateful for today? Who am I checking on and connecting with today? What expectations of normal am I letting go of today? How am I moving my body? And what beauty am I creating or inviting right now? I think we will be really surprised when we ask these questions and we pay attention and when we pause and listen. It's having the courage, isn't it, to go deeper with our inner lives, which I think all these three practices offer. So as we started at the beginning with imagining maybe our favourite place and we were sat in this space together, we hope it's been a safe and a helpful space. And we do invite comments or questions, and I'm going to hand back to Tim. Thank you.
Well, Jane and Margaret, thank you very much just for sharing some very practical ideas with us and giving people one or two hints as to what they might do and experiment with, perhaps for some people, or be reminded of for others. And just to remind people, do have a look at the handout, so you can find a link to it. In fact, it's in the comments section on the right-hand side of your screen, or below the video on the other websites. And So I think we'll have a conversation now between the three of us. We've only got one question that's so far come in, which we'll come to in a moment. So can I please encourage you, if you're watching and you're taking part in this, do give us some fuel for a discussion by adding a comment or two or a question. You can just post it and it'll appear, and we can select from that various ones to talk about. So let's make this a conversation. Do please take part. But if I can be a bit cheeky and ask a first question of Jane and Margaret, either or both of you. You talked about reflecting on our day and using reflection techniques from other cultures, and also reflecting on our image of God. How do these interact with, say, biblical meditation? So what's the place of the Bible in these contemplative practices?
Shall I kick off, Margaret? Yeah, it's a good question, Tim. So for me, the contemplative bit with the kind of Bible is specifically I would enter into what I call the gospel contemplation. So if I'm doing the prayer of examine, I might not specifically be looking at the Bible at that point, but I would set aside a separate time. So, you know, we've just been through we are in the Easter period. So the story of the Emmaus Road is a brilliant story that lends itself to a gospel contemplation, I think. So for me, that would be a kind of separate practice where I might sit and pause, read the story, Lectio Divina style, chew over the words, and kind of make my own response to God. So I'd have a leisurely conversation, I think, and use the Bible in that way. If Margaret wants to add.
Yes, I think with the Eastern style meditation, you can imagine that if you're able to achieve stillness, then you might meditate on a particular phrase or expression that you might repeat in your heart or in your spirit, or indeed out loud. Often one of the names of God, often Lord Jesus Christ, Lamb of God, have mercy on us. And there are some exercises in the book of that nature that will help you to begin that if you want to try that practice.
Okay, well, thank you. So still want to encourage you to take part and add some questions. I'm just going to bring one up here from Liz. It says, can you say how we can find our Enneagram type later? Perhaps one of you might want to talk, just to explain very briefly what an Enneagram is, or what the Enneagram is. So some people may not know that. So just talk to that for a moment would be great.
Sure. Shall I answer that, Margaret? Yeah. So Enneagram is, I was just in conversation with somebody about this yesterday, in fact. The short answer is, I think I can see Liz has asked that question, so I'll respond to Liz. Thank you for that question. It's one of many kind of tools that help us understand more about ourselves. So kind of personality, our way of being, and it deeply challenges us about how we kind of show up in the world, really. I think that's my best description of it. We have Enneagram experts out there. People do training courses on it. There's books on it. The short answer, Liz, is that you can go online. I don't have the link to hand, but you can do a questionnaire. But if you want to know more deeper, come back to me and I'll happily have a conversation separately.
Okay. And I guess there's just questions on practical resources and things also. I want to hear from Sandra. Could you suggest a simple guide to various spiritual practices that could be used at this time with small groups via Zoom? So perhaps this is stepping away from the individual tool and something that can be done with a small group. Margaret, I don't know whether you have any ideas you can point people towards.
Yeah, well, again, I think particularly for people who are setting out into meditation, it is really helpful to do that as a group. And it would be fine to do that on Zoom. And I think with exercises such as these, where there are instructions, it's really helpful to have somebody giving the instructions, and the wider group don't need to worry about that. They can simply hear the instructions and follow, perhaps with their eyes closed. So if somebody's instructing you to focus on your breathing, and your posture and how to do that, or leading you through a meditation on awareness of different parts of your body as you become still, it's very helpful to have a leader giving you the instructions and plenty of time in between, so you can enter more fully into the practice. The same is true, isn't it, for Lectio Divina? Somebody can lead you through that, and then you're free just to enter right into the scene yourself. Those are my suggestions for Zoom groups.
So Margaret, would you recommend that you don't introduce to a group what you haven't yourself tried and are personally familiar with? I guess there's a slight danger here, maybe.
I think that's wonderful advice for anything, Tim, yes.
Well, please. I'm not sure necessarily we always do that. Yeah. Alison McKay is asking about spiritual direction. This is, I think, something that's growing actually in growing awareness in Baptist circles about the benefits of spiritual direction. But the number of practitioners for spiritual direction in terms of directors you can go to in the Baptist world is still fairly small. Jane, where can people go if they want a spiritual direction? Sure,
I think it's a really good question. And I've been struck as I was exploring yesterday, for example, on the St. Bino's website, which is a kind of Jesuit spirituality centre in North Wales. And you may know, those who are listening, they offer lots of retreats, for example, individual guided retreats. But I've just noticed this last week, what they've started doing is offering spiritual direction via telephone, Skype, WhatsApp, Zoom. And I've been really impressed as I've read some of their stuff. So I would urge people in the first instance to go to the Jesuit spirituality website. I think that's the most helpful starting point, because it gives you a brief as well as to what is spiritual direction. And obviously people aren't meeting physically anyway. So for those that just want to even test it out and say, well, you know, I'm kind of interested in finding a spiritual director kind of spiritual direction, or want help with that, then I'd recommend there. But I'm sure there are others as well. Well, I know there are others. I think it depends geographically, maybe where you are as well. There are quite a few in London. And I know Tim's been doing some work on kind of continuing ministerial development. So we're really encouraging this amongst all our ministers in particular, but not just for ministers. It's back to helping people pay attention to their inner life.
I think I'd also encourage people not to be afraid in this to look to other denominations and other partners for spiritual direction. In fact, it can even be helpful, I think, because it challenges our own traditions. And I think depending again on where you live, but often your local Anglican diocese will have a register of spiritual directors. And personally, that's how I found the one that I'm using at the moment. I got in contact with the relevant person at the diocese, and they were very happy to help. I guess if all 1,500 Baptist ministers descend on the Anglican diocese and ask, we may have a problem. But at the moment, I think there's space there if people want to try that route as well. And if I could just throw another question in myself, I want to pick up something that I think, Jane, you said. You mentioned someone had said to you that if they stopped at all, they just find they cry, they turn to tears. A number of people are saying we can't reflect too much at this moment. Almost in the emergency, we have to keep busy, we have to focus on the basics. And so is there a balance to be found between activity and reflection, or even a danger of too much in a reflection, revealing things we can't deal with?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, Tim. And I think each of us walks a fine line. And I mean, I found myself on this own kind of particular journey over Easter. So, for example, Good Friday, you know, is a day when, I don't know about you, but for me, it can feel like I've been to a funeral often as I try and sit with Jesus and imagine some of that pain. And that particular weekend, I'd actually kind of been part of an online retreat. And I remember sitting with this kind of pretty much on Good Friday. And at the end of the day, I think I said to myself, I need to stop now because it doesn't feel safe, because there was so much reflection going on, not only with the pain of the death of Jesus and the theology and the events of that weekend, but also the pain in the world, which is absolutely unbelievably massive right now. So I think we walk a fine line, and I think we need both. That there's no hierarchy. One is not right and one isn't wrong. For me, I think it's about just being gentle and paying attention to what I think God is inviting me to at this moment. And if I find it's like, well, it's just too much right now, the grief is overwhelming, then there might need to be a shift. For those that are mega activists, I'd invite them maybe just to pause if they can. So we try and get a balance and listen to each other. Which is another interesting question as well. Who are we around at the moment? Is it all kind of contemplatives? Is it all activists? We've seen it all, haven't we? We're seeing it now.
And like Margaret, you said earlier, I think that you're an introverted personality type. So the silence suits you. Again, for those who are more activist, more extrovert, contemplation, I presume, is it a harder thing for them to manage and do?
I think so, yes. I think I've seen that among friends. But I would like to suggest that contemplation, prayer and listening are all doing things. They're not only being. I know we can, polarize these things, and just wanted to say hello to Pete in Harborne Baptist Church, who's written about this. And obviously our denomination, our tradition can incline us to be doers a lot more than beers. As Baptists sometimes, and in church life, I realise how busy we are. And it's quite hard to drop all of that and lay it down. It can feel like a bereavement, and it's too extreme a change. I sympathise with you, Pete, trying to help guide people through into that. But I want to encourage us to think that these things are also doing. I feel very strongly that we must listen now, that God has called us to this. And it is God who has stopped us. Actually, not the virus in that sense. God has stopped us doing a lot of our activities, and we must listen and be still, but as ministers to try to support people into that. I have found, well, I know this is a bit scandalous for some of our other denominational groups, but I've been offering communion online, and that is something we can do together by the Spirit, and it is active. It's a thing we can do, but in which we can meet God in a way that is normal for us and have a real sense of fellowship, of togetherness at the table by the grace of God, even though we may be looking at a screen. I do think that this is too short a time to change the nature of a church over from active to passive, but rather perhaps to notice that we may not have that balance as much as we would like in our congregation, and to plan for the future, that when we come back, we try to find that balance between doing and being as a whole church, and perhaps find some practical ways forward into that later on.
Yeah, and I also noticed Pete in the comments from Harborne Baptist Church is saying about a sense of grief and loss in mourning over the loss of activity. I just want to say one of the webinars that we have coming up is around grief and bereavement, and I hope that webinar will be broad. It won't just be about the loss of people who have died because of the pandemic, but also the sense of grief for many other things, whether it be jobs or security and certainty, or indeed, in the case of busy Baptists, it is activity that we are sensing a loss of. So do tune into that one in a few weeks' time. And just looking at another comment from Alison, she's also just mentioned APS. So APS is the Association of Pastoral Supervisors and Educators. There's another way we can process, I suppose, what we're dealing with in our workplaces, particularly if we're ministers, So pastoral supervision sits alongside spiritual direction. It's not quite the same thing. Spiritual direction, I understand, is targeting more our inner life and getting us to reflect on how we are, our walk with God. Pastoral supervision is more to do with processing how we are managing our job and the relationships around that and our own emotional response to our work. And just to give people a bit of a heads up, that when we hopefully later on this year or early next introduce something about continuing ministerial development, we're going to be encouraging you, if you're in leadership of a church, to have some sort of accompaniment, whether it's spiritual direction, pastoral supervision, mentoring, coaching, learning community, some form of accountability. So thank you, Alison, for that suggestion. I'll just bring up the initials there. It's called APPS. You can see, do check them out as well if you are wanting some support in your ministry at this time, processing what you're going through. So do encourage if there are any more questions or comments out there, do please post them. We have a few minutes left. Jane and Margaret, I don't know if there's anything you just want to ask each other or chip in with that you feel is now needing to be said that hasn't been said. I'm fairly putting you on the spot.
I do have I love what Jane has shared about the image of God, and I resonate with our tendency to remake God in the image that we have expected or learned. And it's great that so many of us have the opportunity to listen to services or preaching online from other denominations. It's a real opportunity. And that individual or denominational image of God does come across. And we have a chance to broaden our understanding as churches as to who God is by dipping into other people's experiences.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Margaret. I mean, that came out of a kind of personal reflection as well, and as I just found myself really asking, is this a space or a season where the image of God might shift? And and then you're right, even for the denominations, Margaret, I think that's a really interesting reflection as well. So what are we seeing, and how are others responding? And even the way different denominations have responded to this has been interesting. So there's much to learn. And with this kind of webinar that we're doing, I know that other denominations are having the same conversation. So when you mentioned about communion, Margaret, I know that the Catholics are having that conversation, which, as you can imagine, is much more complex. And for them, it's a massive challenge right now. So maybe for me, as I've listened to you two and other comments as well, it's about recognising that we're in this together with other denominations and other cultures in particular. So that was a gift. And I just want to say thank you for those that have checked in, and to Margaret and Tim. It's been a privilege.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We've had no further questions come in. I could keep going on my list of questions, but I think as we approach about 45 minutes, maybe that's a good place to pause. So can I just say a huge thank you, Jane and Margaret, for giving your time to come and take part and share some of your experience and wisdom. And I hope it's a conversation that people will continue to have in other forums on Facebook or whatever else, using to network with one another. So thank you very much for joining me today. And just to remind people, there will be a recording, of course, of the webinar on the website. So if you want to point other people towards it, then please do so. And a reminder again, next week, so at 1 o'clock next week, we are going to be exploring this new anthology of worship resources, gathering up the crumbs, written by Baptist women to celebrate the centenary of Baptists, women's ordination and accreditation. And Pat Twitt will be leading the conversation next week with a number of authors and editors. So please do join in with that discussion 1 o'clock next week if you can. I just also want to say that if you've got any feedback that you want to give about the webinars generally, then do email ministries@baptist.org.uk, and that will get through to me. We're very much experimenting with these. We'd love to have your comments or maybe suggestions of topics we could cover. At the moment, we're trying to stick with the theme of addressing the issues arising from the pandemic, but it may be that we can carry on with some webinars beyond the end of lockdown or whatever. So if you've got topics you think we might be covering, want to cover, then please let us know. And then finally, a reminder, tonight there is another prayer broadcast from the Baptist Union, and that's going to be led by Lynn Green and Eric Adu from Bristol. And so to join in 7 o'clock this evening, again, you get to that through the Baptist Union website. Other than that, I think it just leaves me to say thank you for joining us, and God bless you, and may you sense him drawing near to you as you practice your own devotional life and perhaps experiment with some of the things we've been talking about today. So goodbye for now.